Welcome to the For Everyday Disciples podcast, where we share the good news of how much God loves us, how we respond in love to Him, and how we reflect His love to our neighbors.
Hi, friends, and welcome to the For Everyday Disciples podcast by Wayfinders. I'm Giles.
And I'm Allison. So today we're going to talk about a hot topic. No, we actually think it's very timely for this new year, and it's about boundaries. So what they are, what they aren't, how we can appropriately set boundaries and still love our neighbor well as Jesus instructed us.
That's right. Of course, as everyday disciples of Jesus, we want to love others well and be healthy in all of our relationships. Maybe that's even your goal or resolution this year, and better navigating your relationships with friends, families, coworkers, even those difficult relationships that you may have. Those people that God has put in our pathways, but we don't always enjoy interacting with.
Yes. And we all know that relational tension can cause a lot of stress and anxiety in our lives, even those times we're trying to be intentional about how we treat other people.
Going back to the holidays, it tends to be that even if you are in good relationships with people and positive relationships with people, spending that kind of time with each other really can begin to violate some of those boundaries.
Right.
So today what we want to do is we want to talk about some practical ways to perhaps ease some of those tensions through better communication and setting boundaries with our loved ones so that expectations and poor communication don't cause mischief in our relationships. So, Allison, can we start by you defining for us what a boundary actually is?
Yeah, that's actually a great place to start. I love language and definitions. I think we need to frame this up. So I want to preface this first by saying Giles and I are not clinical psychologists. We all probably know that. But we've actually kind of delved into this topic quite a bit and found a lot of good resources on it. So today we're going to rely pretty heavily on materials from Dr. Henry Cloud. He is a clinical psychologist, and he literally wrote the book on boundaries, and we'll link that in the show notes. But he addresses this topic also from a biblical worldview, which of course is very important to us and what we value. So Dr. Cloud defines a boundary as a property line. And I love this analogy. So let's picture a house that's sitting in the middle of a yard, and it's surrounded by a fence. So everything within that fence is my property. I own it. I control it. I'm responsible for it. And, I have to keep up my property, right? I have to maintain the inside and outside of my house. I have to, now, this time of year, remove snow from my driveway, the sidewalks, maybe mow my grass, clean up the leaves, like all those things that you do to maintain your property. But beyond that fence line, it's no longer my property. Now it's your property. And I am not responsible for your property. I don't own it. I don't control it. You do. So if I step over the line into your property without your permission, I'm violating your boundaries. And the same goes for if you're stepping into my yard, you're violating my boundaries.
Boundaries. I'm thinking about this fall at our office here at Wayfinders. There are so many leaves that fall on the ground.
Oh my goodness. You don't even know. You who are listening, it's like an avalanche of leaves.
But there's also, we don't really have fences in the front area. So I believe it's like just owning those leaves for a little bit before they're blown into our neighbor's yard. So obviously we are not keeping good boundaries or
right. We're not being responsible.
We're trespassing upon our neighbor's property by allowing all the leaves here to float into their yard because right. We just don't want to rake. But Dr. Cloud actually uses this word trespassing, the word I just said, in the Bible. From the Bible, right? It's in the Lord's Prayer, we hear Jesus, when he instructs us to pray, he says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Mm-hmm. So I'm trespassing actually on someone else's boundaries when I try to control them in some way. So this is obviously a little bit worse than leaves blowing into their yard.
Right.
This can be in a manipulating way that's like dictating their choices or forcing them to live up to my standards or pressuring them into doing what I want them to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that perspective on trespassing because I think it's kind of unique. And yeah, it sounds harsh, but it really is manipulation when I'm trying to control someone else's behavior or decisions or emotions. Because when you think about it in that moment, who am I focused on? I'm focused on myself and my perceived need and not what you desire, even necessarily what's best for you. And because of that self-focus, I'm sort of like strong arming you to get my way. So whether that's directly, I could be saying it directly, or in a passive aggressive way, so indirectly. And that's certainly not loving you well. And it's not even serving you well. It's really self-serving.
When you spoke about a manipulation there too, and about how it's sort of strong arming, I mean, I take that, for me, that's pretty personal because I know that when I really am struggling in the flesh and struggling in my walk with God, what can be a good thing, which is my ability to be able to engage or be bold in relationships or even be strong, can turn into manipulation of others. And so I have to be concerned all the time about violating boundaries when I am not in a good place. And I mean, that includes even in the relationship, Allison, with you, that's sometimes when I'm in those darker spaces where I've not gotten enough rest, or if I'm just not walking with God the way that I want to be, something that can be turned of good, right? We can turn to bad. And that manipulation is one of those, which in a lot of ways, it's obviously a control issue, but it's so dangerous because it's controlling people.
Yeah, that's a really good point about when I'm not healthy or operating in an unhealthy space because, or even just not being intentional. Like I might think that in doing that, quote, for you, that I'm helping you, like if I'm trying to control an outcome of something for you or a decision you're making, I guess I'm thinking with outcome, or I can't really control your emotions. I mean, you can allow someone to make you feel a certain way, I guess. But just, I might think I'm helping you out by doing that, but it's actually, we're going to talk about this a little later on. It's actually not loving because I am not allowing you to be responsible for your own life. So I'm kind of like charging in and taking over, which is not loving.
And sometimes when we have someone that's doing that in our life and they're being strong about that, but it's not from a healthy place, sometimes as Christians, we can be actually very passive because we believe that that's the loving thing. So we think that setting a boundary is a mean thing or it's unkind or it's not loving them well as Jesus has commanded us to do. But it's actually the opposite, right? Because we're actually allowing them to actually be in some of their worst places, right? Because boundary violators, they're not typically healthy people. And I'm not saying that doesn't mean that they're not healthy in a lot of situations in our life, but when someone is being unhealthy, it's almost always a guarantee that they're going to violate boundaries. So what we can do is actually set those boundaries because that's the loving thing actually to do. Yeah,
again, I'm not allowing you to take ownership over your life, to be responsible for your own actions, feelings, and choices. And Dr. Cloud talks about this concept of responsibility for versus responsibility to. So let's put this in, right, the Christian context. Because like you said, I think it's true that a lot of Christians think that boundaries are mean. And honestly, that's a little bit how I was raised of, you're always kind and pleasing and these things, and sometimes you end up being a doormat, right? And that's also not healthy. So he talks about this distinction of responsibility for versus responsibility to. I'm responsible only for myself. But as a disciple of Jesus, I'm responsible to you. So I'm not responsible for you. I'm responsible to you. And he gives this, I think, great illustration from the book of Galatians in the Bible. And it's in Galatians 6, chapter 6. But in verse 2, we're told to carry each other's burdens to fulfill the law of Christ. Carry each other's burdens to fulfill the law of Christ. So I'm responsible to you to help you carry your burden. And a burden is something that's too heavy for you to bear on your own. So maybe that burden is the death of a loved one, or a debilitating disease, or a divorce, or a trauma that you've experienced. That's a burden. You'd be crushed under the weight of that if you had to carry it alone. So I am instructed to carry it with you in love. And that's how I love you. That's how I love my neighbor. But on the other hand, Paul talks about in Galatians 6:5 that each one should carry their own load. So there's this distinction in burden and load. I am not responsible for your load. And how do we define that? What's a load? Well, these are your daily responsibilities and any aspect of your life that you have to take ownership of. So that's your own feelings, your own behaviors, your attitudes, your choices. And your load is really, and my load is really what God has given me to steward. It's where he's given me freedom, the ability to exercise, I can't say that word, self-control. And unlike a burden, it's not this, crushing boulder. It's more like a knapsack, a backpack, a purse that I'm able to carry on my own. So nobody should be trying to do that for me, or I shouldn't be doing that for you. It's light enough that you can carry. So it's an issue of self-control and freedom and good stewardship.
Thanks for sharing that illustration, because even for me, as I was listening to it and as I was listening to you speak about that, I mean, those can be very blurred lines.
Yes.
Like, what is a burden and what is a load? And I think even when we have looked at that scripture so often in the past, we don't even think of, we get confused about what is the distinction between these two things. And I think that Henry Cloud did a great job of defining those distinctions. Now, it doesn't mean that we're going to fully understand or always be perfect at it, but you have to start with a foundation of something. And so knowing this concept of what's mine and what's yours, right? Mm-hmm. And that the load is what I'm responsible for my own life, and for what you're responsible. Your load is what you're responsible for in your life. And trying to then carry someone else's load is what gets us in so much trouble in relationships. So again, those blurred lines of like, am I carrying your load for you?
Yeah, you're overstepping.
Yeah, and I think we could even use a word in that situation of enabling. Like, you can really be enabling someone because you're carrying a load that they're supposed to be carrying, and actually it's stunting their growth. It's actually impacting them in a very negative ways.
Exactly.
So if I'm carrying the load that you should be carrying, then I also can become bitter and resentful towards you.
Right, because it puts, I don't use this word burdens, but it puts a load on me. So, suddenly like my backpack is becoming heavier, and really it could escalate, I guess, to the point of a burden that I can't carry.
And if you're someone like me that really struggles sometimes, even with limits of the things that I should do.
Right, yes.
I mean, I have so many opportunities of incredible God things that, he just keeps revealing and revealing and revealing. If I'm struggling with the limits of that, how much worse is that if I'm also like taking on other people's loads? Right. Or how cruel is that if I'm putting that expectation of someone else carrying that load for me? Yes. Because it may not be my responsibility, and it may be a limit that I need to have for myself, but it doesn't mean that automatically means I need to put it upon someone else. Right. Sometimes we just have to release those things. So if we're carrying someone else's load, we can really hurt our own emotional health. Because, again, talking about those responsibilities, so many of us already have so many responsibilities that what happens when you're taking on too much and you're not getting rest? And, I mean, you're not only in a way creating a space for that person to become unhealthy. You're creating a space for you to become unhealthy.
Right. And the other person, we don't want to, we hate to use this term like irresponsible, but it's true. Like if we're saying you own, control, responsible for your own life, then if I keep taking that over, then the other person's not taking ownership for their own life. So that could lead to irresponsibility, as you said, and then like really serious damage, potentially. Thinking
about discipleship, it's so much about empowering and encouraging. Really, a big part about discipleship is it's people taking responsibilities for their own loads.
Yeah, that's a good word.
I mean, I feel like what does it mean for you to take responsibility for your own load? And then the second part of discipleship is loving your neighbor, right? So it's how can you help your neighbor with their burden? I mean, so a big part about emotional health, a big part about being spiritually healthy, and of course these things are all related, is the ability to be able to own your own load.
Right, because it's that we're loving others as we love ourselves. So that's part of loving myself, is valuing myself enough to take ownership and responsibility for my own life.
Let's talk about the practical things about what does it mean to create those boundaries, especially with those that are the closest to us. And we spent time with Allison's family, or any family really, over Christmas. But those are individuals that we normally maybe don't spend a lot of time with. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, talk about the boundaries you're saying. Yeah. So as we're thinking about, maybe this is some post-reflection of like after the fact, but then even like thinking about the year ahead, I know a lot of people plan their family vacations or when they're going to spend time with extended family, maybe or just be with family, period. Giles and I are saying that because we've always lived apart from our extended family. They've lived either states away or hours away, or, not in the same town. So that's where my mindset is of, we see each other a handful of times a year versus we're together every day. But this equally applies if you're together every day.
I'd say it's both can be equally dangerous for different reasons maybe, but both can be equally dangerous whether or not you are in a constant close relationship or whether you are in a distant relationship. They both can be dangerous in regards to boundaries.
Yeah. So I'm going to take kind of an extreme example. Maybe it's not extreme, but we'll give kind of an everyday about expectations in a little bit, but let's think about that one relative. I'm going to use relative. It could be friend, but
could be enemy.
It could be an enemy.
I like to use that word. I like to use that word because I think if there's multiple boundary infractions, it's like, are they really a friend? I'm not so sure. But.
Okay, well, let's stick with relative.
Relative ones you cannot choose.
Yeah, since we're talking in the context of, and of like Christmas that just happened and maybe family vacation. So there's that one relative who pushes all your buttons, right? Maybe it's because they're overly critical of you and they say stuff to you or about you that they shouldn't be saying, lack of boundaries. Maybe they make passive aggressive remarks, even about the amount of time that you're spending with them. So I'm thinking about this being apart and not being together every day, or maybe you are together every day and they're still making comments about the amount of time that you're spending with them. So that's kind of like an indirect jab, right, of pressuring you to stay longer. So it's like, again, violating a boundary. Maybe they're critiquing something about how you're parenting your kids, or asking too many personal questions about your life. So they're entering an area, I'm thinking about our single friends, and maybe it's like continuously asking you about dating relationships or, that kind of personal sphere where you've told them, I don't really want to talk about this, or I don't want to share every detail. And they keep pushing in, to get you to share. Right. Or maybe it's the perennial controversial topic that we all know, the topics we're not supposed to talk about: politics, religion, right now, international conflicts. And again, this person just keeps pushing into that. They want to talk about those controversial things, no filter. They just say whatever they want to say. So if we're thinking about, that's a lot of scenarios, but I'm just trying to set up this person that's pushing your buttons. So how do you respond, Giles, in a healthy way?
Well, if you haven't thought about how you're going to respond, let's remember one thing very critical right now. We have entered into 2024. I guarantee there's going to be some political conversations coming your way.
Oh, true.
So this is something to really be thinking about right now, because we're just starting the season of it getting really bad. And I think we all remember what happened in 2020. We all remembered what happened in 2016, how many fractured relationships, boundaries were violated. So again, if you're like, I don't have any boundary issues, you're about to have some. So let's
Absolutely.
Right. So
right.
It is certainly tough when someone pushes all of your buttons. So again, one of the funny things we talked about at work yesterday was all of us had returned from family. And again, we love family, but there's typically always some boundary violations in that. And I also like to say it's very hard to be a healthy person in a potentially unhealthy environment. But we had this whole joke about what would be really funny is if we had bingo cards made up for everyone to take on their family vacations or to visit other family members about the consistent irritable things that relatives may do or say. And then,
irritating. I think you mean the irritating things. Yeah.
Irritating.
Yeah.
Sorry. My great English.
You're irritable. I'm feeling irritable about the irritating things.
to add some humor to it, because sometimes we get caught up in those situations with constant boundaries being violated, honestly.
Breached. Yeah.
And instead of maybe moving to that bitterness, we were like, well, what if we handled it with humor? Now, of course, this is not the right response.
It's pretty funny, though.
But it is pretty funny. And I know that all of you are already like thinking about, well, I know what squares would be on that bingo at my house. And winner guess what? Winner is if everybody else loses in the boundary war, right? Because it's like, well, they did all of those things. But one of the ways that we typically respond is not by a bingo card.
Right.
Maybe this can be the new way. But one of the ways we typically respond is by being defensive. So what we want to do when someone violates our boundaries is we want to defend our actions, our choices. We want to defend our opinions. But even if that relative who pushes my buttons has set no boundaries for themselves and trespasses on my boundaries, instead of becoming defensive, I can hold that property line. I can hold my property line. I can still keep my boundaries, because I think I don't want to be reacting out of my emotions, especially when I'm feeling like someone's violating my boundaries. I don't want to react out of emotion, right? And if I'm holding my property line, I'm responsible for my own feelings and how I will handle them, right? So I have options. Of course, if I go to my emotional side, and I'm...
Or in the flesh, as you said,
I'm like in the flesh.
Unhealthy moment.
Yeah, I can explode. I can try to control them or manipulate them, as I already said that with my response. Oh, and how often do we do this kind of thing, right? Is try to like overpower them with some kind of reason or response about why they are behaving in this way. But maybe I can make another choice. Maybe I can make the Christ choice, that I can do it in a redemptive way. A way that will help foster a relationship and gives them that opportunity to act more loving towards me. Now, of course, if they really struggle with boundaries, this is hard.
Right.
But again, we're still, what is a burden? What is a load? So we still have a responsibility.
And I think I love how you said giving them the opportunity to act more loving toward me, because you think about, like, if I'm getting defensive, what happens when someone gets defensive with me potentially? Or if I'm getting defensive, does that de-escalate or escalate the discussion or conversation?
I'll tell you the answer is not de-escalate.
It usually escalates it, right? So by me reacting and responding in a redemptive way, then I am de-escalating that, and I'm giving them the opportunity to do that too, whether or not they will, but I'm giving them that opportunity. And we talk about this. I want you to talk a little bit about being right versus being righteous. And I'm saying righteous in the sense of holy, right? Being like God. sometimes I think we just get that tunnel vision again. It's a defensive posture of we want to be right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I actually say quite a bit. There's this saying I started saying several years ago because I kept finding myself in situations, especially in discipleship, where I was having conversations with people and they would constantly be going to, but they're wrong. Mm-hmm. Right. And this was in relationship. They would be talking about different people in their life and they'd be like, they're wrong. They're wrong. Now, the question wasn't whether or not they were right or wrong. They absolutely were wrong. The question is how do we respond? And in relationship I basically started coming up with a saying of, is it sometimes wrong to be right? Because there's a difference, right? Mm-hmm. And I think when we talk about righteousness is full of this aspect of self-sacrifice, of laying oneself down for others, of serving someone else instead of trying to serve ourselves. Mm-hmm. I think when we talk about right, we tend to be going the opposite direction of, I need to serve myself.
Yes.
And so it's a pride thing. It's a dehumanizing for other people, right? And it doesn't mean that you can't be right, but it's like, is that the time and the opportunity and the place to be expressing your rightness, or is it the time and the place to be showing your righteousness?
Yeah, it's kind of that difference between reacting and responding. So if I'm reactionary, then I'm going to probably go into that unhealthy place where I'm going to defend and be right, try to be right. So it's like I'm reacting. I'm allowing the other person to kind of set the tone, set the stage, and I'm reacting to that negatively versus if I'm responding, I've already set my intention. We talk about that a lot on this podcast of setting our intention. So I think you said this or alluded to this, but like doing that ahead of time, like knowing I'm walking into that situation because we know that person that pushes our buttons and we're going to be around them, right? We know. And so walking into that with the intention, I'm going to respond well and not react and not be reactionary.
Is it okay for us to release other people? And that's a real question I have to ask, because is it okay for us to do that? Because I think that one of the ways that we can release other people is by not responding, and especially not responding out of an emotion with them. But here's the thing you have to be aware of. This is a motivation of the heart kind of issue, because I may be someone who's not responding, and yet I'm holding resentment and bitterness within my heart towards that individual.
That's
so
valid.
I know that a lot of times in relationships, we may say, well, I'm just not going to say anything. But then we're having all of these conversations within our head, saying all of these things about this person. So if we're going to respond appropriately, and especially if we say, I'm going to take the response of, I'm not going to speak something mean or something that's going to try to hurt this people in this situation, our heart has to also be in that same place of saying, but I'm releasing them is why. Not because I'm going to hold all these things against them in my heart and just be quiet about it, because that just leads to massive passive aggressiveness, what we already talked about. And it's a violation. You're violating a boundary even in your quietness, because you are holding so many things of bitterness and hate within your heart towards that person.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, and that's the time and place to process it with the Lord, right? I mean, it's, I may be feeling that way in the moment, but then later I'm repenting of that. Or I'm asking God to show me the motivations of my heart, in that. And so that is critical, I think, to happen at that time, with the Lord. So, and of course with the other person, we're hoping, this is kind of the ideal, right? That if we respond a certain way, then they will respond in kind. But I mean, it may not be. They may continue to breach my property line.
That's also why there's that releasing, not saying you don't set the boundaries, but releasing that person, because you realize maybe they can't. For some reason they can't.
Right. And so I should still exercise self-control, because again, I'm responsible for me and not you. So my actions have consequences. Your actions have consequences. And that's the biblical principle of reaping and sowing. As Dr. Cloud says, you reap what you sow. And so we have to allow someone to experience those negative consequences if they're making poor choices. So if they're continuing to come at me, they're continuing to violate my boundaries, they're not respecting my autonomy, they're being super disrespectful and mean-spirited, maybe the limit I set is I'm only going to be around you for this amount of time. Like, I'm still going to engage with you. I'm still going to try to love you well and respond in a redemptive way. But if you're continuing to come at me, or I know you have shown you're acting in that way, then I'm going to say, we're going to do this visit for like an hour, and then that's it. That's the limit. Or maybe it's, if I can't set that kind of time limit, maybe it's that I'm going to walk away from you in the conversation, try to leave it at a good place, but that I'm not going to continue to engage with you if you're going to keep pushing in an unhealthy way. And I think that's a fair consequence to them of what they're sowing, which is really manipulation. They're continuing to sow manipulation. So that's a fair consequence to say, I'm going to limit my time with you, or I'm going to walk away.
And I think that on a normal daily basis, right, in a lot of our relationships, we can have boundaries and we can set those boundaries, and it may not even seem offensive even to a person that struggles with boundaries. It may just be, I walked away in a situation. I think it's so hard during those times when we are almost in like a trapped place with people. And that's why the holidays, I think people
Your captive audience.
Right. I think that's why during the holidays, so many of us struggle with boundaries. And what I would say about that is it's just an expression of, we struggle with it because we haven't equipped ourselves really to handle boundaries. And so then we're in a place now where your boundaries are guaranteed to be violated. And again, maybe in a normal day-to-day activity, when you're not constantly in location with these individuals, proximity with these individuals, you could just walk away. But when you're trapped in that, you do have to learn some of these boundary techniques, and actually it will help you in a lot of other situations as well. But it's one of those things that maybe it's exposing something within you of an area that you can grow in, because people who have no boundaries, they will almost always violate our boundaries. And that's because of what we said earlier. They don't know where they end and where we begin, right? So they don't know where they end and we begin. They don't understand agency and autonomy. So, of course, they will be hurt, if I or Allison or any of us try to set a boundary with those individuals or limit them, because I think that's really it. And again, there's such a lack of self-awareness that even as we're saying these things, you do understand that when we talk about people that don't understand boundaries, you could say this exact thing to them and they will even be listening to this podcast. There will be people that really struggle with violating other people's boundaries, and they literally will not know that you're talking to them. That's the dangerous thing about this. Is why Henry Cloud focuses so much on this, is because it is really an area where people really lack self-awareness in. Yeah,
and I think that setting the boundary or the limit can be really hard for people pleasers. And I can speak totally to that because I've grown in that a lot. But I have that tendency to want to people please, and we don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. Right.
So I'm a manipulator in my bad state, and Allison's a people pleaser. Very opposite, but it's still doing damaging things. Right.
And so we have this idea of like, well, they're going to get upset with me, which again, like we said, if that person doesn't have any boundaries and they're not self-aware, they are going to get upset. It's going to hurt their feelings. But there's a difference between being hurt and being harmed. And this is another point Dr. Cloud makes, which I think is so valid for us people pleasers. It's okay. It's okay for someone to feel hurt. It's okay for them to feel discomfort or to be upset when they're doing something wrong. Especially I'm thinking again of this extreme situation where they're being super disrespectful and hurting me by what they're saying or how they're acting. So it's okay for them to feel discomfort. They should. They're doing something wrong. They shouldn't be trying to control me or manipulate me. So in that moment, it's like I'm closing the gate to them. So we talk about I guess we haven't talked about it yet, but with boundaries, it's really a gate and not a wall. So I think that's the part about loving our neighbor is, we can close the gate at that moment when they're doing something wrong, but I'm not building a wall against them that can never be breached. I'm just shutting the gate and the fence. So if, they're taking responsibility for their behaviors, attitudes, and feelings, if they're acting in a respectful way to me, if they're, what's the word? They're not dehumanizing me. That's kind of extreme word, but like giving me my autonomy, like respecting me, then I can swing that gate back open and let them in. So it's, again, hurt, but not harm. Harm is a different thing, right?
Typically, when you talk about boundaries, again, going back to that being not aware, right? Typically, when you talk about boundaries and people that don't have boundaries, it is not an intentional act of harm that they are trying to do towards people. But let's make sure to talk about that, because there are people that intentionally try to harm people, and boundaries are a little bit different in that scenario because this is a situation where we've, if you watch any stories, any like Dateline News or anything like that, you'll see this thing culturally today, which is like they call it gaslighting, or this toxic gaslighting where people are truly manipulating other people and intentionally doing it.
Right.
These are people that your boundary is that's an abusive person. So the boundary is, I'm not going to be around you.
Right.
I have to protect myself from harm in that situation. So there is a difference. And Henry Cloud also has another study about wise, foolish, and evil. There's a difference between someone who's foolish and doesn't know how to navigate boundaries, because a lot of times just because of a lack of awareness.
Right.
Between them and someone that is evil, who is looking out to harm and to do harm against you. So this is a part, as you grow in your autonomy and you grow into understand where your boundaries are and how to be a safe person, to recognize those that, you know what? Yes, most of the time you can probably have gates where you can do that. But sometimes with a truly dangerous person, walls do have to be built in those boundaries, and you do have to separate yourself from them.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, hopefully most of us in our lives, daily lives at least, don't run into those types of people who are evil, who are intentionally setting out to destroy us or to destroy the relationship or to destroy you. And that's so true that then it becomes a wall, because you got to protect the good. You got to protect the good and protect yourself from harm. So that's a unique situation. And then hopefully unique situation. But one final note I wanted to make about expectations, because we kind of said this at the beginning. The first point is we all have them. Let's just say we all have expectations. Even if I'm not acknowledging it or thinking that I do, we all have expectations. I place them on myself. I place them on others, and they do the same to me and to themselves. And it becomes a problem, this idea of expectations. It becomes a problem in relationships when those expectations go unfulfilled or unmet. And that happens all the time, right? That happens all the time. So what do? The answer is communication, good communication. We communicate clearly. So instead of just assuming that someone knows what I'm thinking, I should tell them. I mean, that's how expectations are built, is because I'm making an assumption about someone or something, and then it turns into this expectation, right? Because we haven't actually talked about it. We haven't actually communicated. So I'm going to use a kind of silly example, but let's say, Giles, my expectation is that you'll cook for me every night, which, by the way, he does. So I don't know if that's an expectation or that you...
I was going to say, that seems very...
really love doing it.
Let me just use this one. It's just sort of an example, but it's reality.
Like what? Like that's
no,
funny.
That's not fair though, because we have talked about it.
No, it is not an expectation. No,
it's not an expectation on my part. We have talked about it that he enjoys doing that, and so.
But you did come about that pretty funny, like bringing that up as I can only find one example I'm going to use. Yeah.
Okay, well, the cooking dinner was kind of the low hanging fruit. I'm just thinking of like in a marriage, some of those like chores, absolutely. Right, and tasks. So. Could be any chore. You could fill in the blank. You're expecting your spouse to take out the trash, or I don't know, whatever wash the dishes, do the laundry. So the first question I need to ask myself is this expectation realistic? And, maybe it's not. Like if you're working 40 plus hours a week outside the home, you're getting home late most nights, or your schedule is such that, you're getting home kind of past like a normal dinner hour. Maybe that's not realistic for me to expect you to cook dinner every night. So that's where, again, we should at least talk about it so that I know what I can communicate to you, what my expectations are, and you the same. Like we can at least know what our expectations are, instead of perhaps me just getting upset when you come home and I'm expecting you to cook dinner and you don't. And then, I'm having to do it like later at night or something because I had placed on you something that expectation that we hadn't really agreed upon. So I need to release you from that until we have that conversation. We agree upon something that is realistic and works for both of us. And then we go forward. Then I can hold you to that. Now this is a dumb example about cooking dinner, but maybe there's something a little deeper or greater that is an expectation that we're agreeing upon it. And then if you violate that expectation or you don't live up to that, then we can have a conversation about that.
Well, in healthy relationships, right, we will be able to come up with something that can work for both of us, right?
Yeah.
But I like how you used the word release, but I like how you used it before. So like how you used it before the coming up with the thing.
Yes.
Because again, when we talked about releasing earlier, you need to release people because guess what? Some of those individuals aren't going to come up with the best plan for both of you, but you still need to release them.
Right.
You still can't be holding them under some false expectation or unrealistic expectation, or I'm going to say this, even a realistic expectation for some people, because for them it still may be unrealistic.
Well, or uncommunicated. I mean, that's another piece of that.
Or unteachable. Like they're just not going to accept it. Yeah.
So definitely definitely some challenging topics today. I mean, it's a challenge for me because I struggle with all of these things, too, and I don't live it out perfectly. So I think it's a good kind of homework assignment this week to think about, where are those areas where I do need to set boundaries in my life, or I need to adhere to the boundaries I already have set? Where do I have expectations upon people, relationships that are being unfulfilled or unmet, and kind of walking through that matrix of, have I communicated it clearly? Is it realistic? All those factors, because it can only harm or hurt relationship if we're not communicating clearly, right?
So going back to the bingo card, I think it's very easy for us to look at other people and to sometimes realize where they're violating our boundaries, and we can make up our little bingo card about these are all the different ways that this person violates my boundaries. But I think another healthy thing for us to do this week is, what would that bingo card look like if we did it for ourselves, about how we're violating the boundaries of other individuals, and where are areas that we can grow in being healthier towards them and not violating their boundaries. Because I think a lot of times when we talk about boundaries, we always look at it as if it's someone else violating. But where are the scenarios in our life that God is calling us to grow in, where we may be trespassing against someone else?
Yeah, we're looking inside the property line instead of outside. So we're like, what's someone throwing in my yard versus what am I throwing in their yard?
I think that's a really good way to do it, as a healthy way, not for shame, but for growth, for us to be able to recognize that, go to God in repentance, and allow Him to help navigate us through His Word, through our relationship with Him, through prayer, to be able to grow in those areas and become healthier people who then are, guess what? Healthier followers of Christ, healthier disciple makers, and people that can actually go out and love others well and love themselves.
Yeah, and maybe even the next step of, as we're interviewing these things, maybe it's even that next step of going to that person whose boundaries I continue to violate. Like, as I'm allowing God to reveal that to me, maybe it's going to that person, and, you don't have to say it like super clinically, but to say like, I realize I've been trying to control this aspect of your life, or I've been, I've overstepped in this. please forgive me. Like, I'm not going to do that again. Like, I'm aware of that now, and I'm not going to do that again. Because I think that kind of second step, I feel like hardly ever happens, even for myself. Like, sometimes I can, talk to God about that, repent of it, as you said, confess and repent it, commit to not doing that again and being intentional, but then I don't actually go to that person. I'm not saying every single situation you should do that. Again, you pray about it and allow God to instruct you on that. But I think that's a really validating thing for someone to, I'm just thinking about myself. If someone came to me and said, like, I realize that I've been overstepping in this area of our relationship, and I'm sorry. Well, I'm going to change.
I'm feeling extremely validated that you have now said this to me. I have been waiting for so long for you to admit to the boundary trespasses that you've done against me. No, I'm just kidding. But it is, I love that. I love that what you're saying about that, because I think it is powerful. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, be prudent.
Right.
And as Allison said, go to God, talk to God, because you have to navigate relationships just with sensitivity anyway. So just be prudent about that. When we were in counseling, after we had gotten back from Kenya, you learn a lot of stuff. You go through experiencing like where you may have had trauma in your life and everything like that. And I just remember some wise advice that the counselors told us there, which I'll share with all of you, which was, you may feel like right now you've just heard this podcast on boundaries and you're like, I need to go talk to everybody about how they're violating boundaries, how they're doing all these things,
right,
how I may have violated these things. And they said, take a little bit of time, really pray about it and see how that is, because don't just drive to the violators or whoever you think that is and just spill it out right now because you haven't had time to process it. So I would give the same advice. This thing on boundaries is, yes, there are probably some boundaries being violated in your life. You're probably violating other people's boundaries in some areas in your life. But spend some time in meditation, contemplation, prayer, being with God. And then as you engage in those relationships, think about, first of all, how can you be better about setting boundaries that need to be set with people that are maybe a little bit, that need boundaries set, mm-hmm. or how can you be better about setting those boundaries with yourself in regards to how you're with other people. And then just navigate that road with God.
Yeah. And as we often say, let love be the lead, yes. right? Let love lead you in that. So yeah, that's great. Well, this has been a good discussion. It's a hard topic. And again, one that, we're not experts in the sense of we still are learning and growing and everything, but we just felt like it was a good topic for this new year, and just in general, a good topic for us to all learn and grow. So thank you all for joining us on this journey of everyday discipleship. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite platform to this podcast so you can never miss an episode. And we want to continue growing together as everyday disciples. And also just leave us some feedback. We would love to hear that of topics you may want to hear us address, or just any thoughts that you have as you're learning and growing with us. So until next time.
Bye, guys.